Right. I think we have a critical mass. I just want to say just a good morning and good afternoon to everyone on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, its Frontlines of Democracy Initiative, and also the Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation. We want to thank you for joining today and welcome you to the event that we're going to focus on Moldova's upcoming presidential election. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at GMF. I'm also joined by my colleague in Bucharest, Alina Inayeh, who's director of GMF's Bucharest office at the Black Sea Trust. I'm also joined by my colleague in Washington, Stela Leuca, as well. And I also just want to thank my colleague, John Alexander, for pulling together this event today. As many of you know, on November 1st, Moldova will hold its presidential election in an environment that is highly contentious, politically polarized, marred already by disinformation and lack of free media, and also with the population struggling to address the challenges and fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. This election is also coming at a time of increased distrust in Moldovan politicians and institutions due to perceived mismanagement of the pandemic by the government, but also a lack of movement on key issues, including democratic reform, combating corruption, and poor economic performance. Reporting in Moldova now is suggesting that President Dodon, who is currently in office right now, and former Prime Minister Maia Sandu are the leading candidates in this election less than several weeks before Moldovans go to the polls and vote. The Moldovan election is also playing out geopolitically, as we know, as pro-Russian President Dodon and his party seem to be moving Moldova further from the EU and transatlantic integration path and taking steps backward on democratic reforms, including combating corruption, which I mentioned earlier. Under President Dodon's leadership, Moldovans have also seen an uptick in Kremlin efforts, including use of measures, including election interference, to make sure, in a sense from broad, what it looks like is to derail Moldova's Euro-Atlantic path. And so we've seen these same actions take place pre-election. We saw that in Belarus, which we're seeing today, in Georgia. Frankly, we're also seeing Russian interference in the US election. And so it seems that Mr. Putin does the most damage when he has a willing partner in power and a country is working with him. Now, the view from many in Washington looking at Moldova today is whether the current government will ensure a free and fair election, or will it be a faulty election that denies Moldovans their right to choose whether they're in Moldova or whether they're voting from abroad. It's hard not to think of the events unfolding in Belarus right now, where Belarusians were denied the right to vote by a dictator in power for 26 years. The reaction of the US and EU and others joining Belarusians over the last several weeks has been calling those elections illegitimate and calling for new elections. And so one has to wonder, with the strength of what the US and the EU are talking about with respect to Belarus, whether that will apply as well if the same occurs in Moldova. And it's something that hopefully we'll be discussing today. And I hope personally that it's imperative that that the US government, the EU, other international partners have consistent policies with respect to elections, whether they take place in Belarus or it takes place in Moldova, Georgia, or the United States. I wanted to just highlight one last point, which is Ambassador Derek Hogan, US Ambassador to Moldova, highlighted, I think, some really important points in the lead up to the election. And what he said was that Moldovan officials still have time to address electoral concerns. He said before November, Moldova's leaders and electoral officials should also take steps to prevent past mistakes from being repeated. And he said in their recent pre-assessment, the OSCE again cautioned about the potential for vote buying, the abuse of state resources, the dangers of politically controlled media, a lack of transparency in campaign financing, and the risks of the manipulation or suppression of voters from Transnistria and the Diaspora. Moldovan officials, he said, still have time to address these longstanding concerns to ensure that all citizens can freely and safely cast their ballots on election day. So I don't think it could be clearer where the US stands. And I understand, and I know this is shared by EU partners as well that have the same expectations about the upcoming election. For further comments, I want to turn to my colleague in Bucharest, Alina Inayeh, who can speak to the view from both Bucharest, but also from the EU and Europe. Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome everybody to this discussion, and thank you for participating in it. The view from Bucharest and the view from European Union, let me tell you, I've been following Moldova, well, I've been following Moldova my entire life, being Romanian, but in my job with GMF, I've been following Moldova for almost 12 years, and for me, it's Groundhog Day. Every time we feel like we made it, Moldova's gonna be once again the front runner of the Eastern Partnership, and it's gonna be an example to all the other countries. Groundhog Day hits again, and we're back to square one. And this is where I feel we are right now, with everything that has been going on lately in the country ever since the Chisinau, the mayoral elections in Chisinau were canceled, what is it, a couple of years ago. Everything was going backwards, and we have seen a lot of slipping back when it comes to democracy, when it comes to rule of law, and when it comes now to the fairness and freedom of the elections. What really worries me is that it's not necessarily these elections. I think everybody is clear that these elections will not necessarily be called free and fair because of everything that's been going on so far, and I don't think people will backtrack necessarily. But what really concerns me, and I think it also concerns the European Union, is what happens on the long term, what happens on the long run, what happens after elections. And it's not only the the political situation which is worrisome, it's also the economic situation which is worrisome. There are engagements that Moldova has with IMF, with the European Union, not clear when and if these are going to fulfill, and in general, what's going to happen economically, and we have the coronavirus crisis on top of it all. So really, from where I sit in Bucharest, and even if I look to it from Brussels, I see very few reasons to be hopeful or to be happy, or not to be very concerned. As we speak today, I was just skimming the news. As we speak today, there is a virtual meeting of the Moldovan Chamber of Commerce and the Belarusian Chamber of Commerce. And I think this pretty much speaks to the situation in Moldova and to where the country might be going under President Dodon. I do want to say that not only we are part of this webinar, but also there are a lot of projects that GMF has in Moldova, including a virtual study tour that will take place 1 week before elections. So maybe for some of you, it's gonna be an occasion to really delve even deeper in the realities of the country, be them political, geopolitical, social, or economic. With this, I think I'd like to turn to the speakers, because I'm pretty sure they have a lot more to say about what's actually going on in Moldova today, on November 1st, and then going forward.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for those comments. I think they were introspective in terms of sort of Groundhog Day, of sort of seeing the same, seeing these same issues play out over and over again. And I would sort of say the same perspective of what's taking place is not optimistic as well in Washington. And so I think, it's a challenge to get people engaged. So there's certainly a lot of interest in this election, not necessarily because of the expectations right now, but because I think people want to see Moldova succeed. There's been a lot of effort, increased support over a number of years from the US and the EU to support this transition. And unfortunately, leadership has not moved Moldova in the right direction. If I can, a couple of things. One, I'm going to turn it over to Stella, but I also just wanted to make an announcement too. There's a Q&A button on Zoom, and please, everybody is an expert on Zoom right now. Feel free to pose questions throughout the entire event, and Stella will do her best to kind of weed through all of them and sort of get them all answered and addressed. So I just want to turn it over to Stella, my colleague in DC, who is also one of the leading experts on civil society and democracy in Moldova and in Eastern Europe. Stella, thank you. And the show is yours. I'm just going to hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Alina. Those are very interesting and very relevant observations indeed. It does feel like Groundhog Day for the last 20 years, at least the time I've been engaged with democratic change in the country. We're very fortunate today to have three amazing speakers with us who are going to help us make a little bit more sense of what is going on in Moldova at the moment and how the pre-election campaign, pre-election activities have really been happening, and also what is the importance of this election regionally, or how do we connect with everything else that's happening. So let's turn to our first speaker. This is Elena Prohnitchi, and she's the secretary of the Civic Coalition for Free and Fair Elections and deputy director of the Association for Participatory Democracy, ADEPT. She has quite extensive experience in the field. And Elena, if you can please just speak to us, how is the politics unfolding, considering the changes in the length of the campaign, like it's been shortened? What are the current candidates and the yet to be registered candidates? What are they doing? What are they saying? How are things happening in terms of person-to-person interaction, also maybe a little bit on the campaign funding and the sources, and what are the current observations?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stella, for introduction. At the beginning, I'd like to mention that the Civic Coalition for Free and Fair Election, which I represent today, consists of 34 NGOs specialized in electoral field that monitors electoral processes in Moldova, including the current presidential elections. Also, the electoral campaign has not officially started yet. The main candidates has informally entered the electoral race. So 13 initiatives, groups for collecting the signatures in favor of their candidates has submitted the request to the Central Electoral Commission. 3 of the candidates have been already registered. 1 candidate, and namely the candidate of the pro-Moldova party, former Democratic Party, yes, was not registered, but it is expected that it will not be registered because according to the legislation, they not they don't enter the legal term for being registered as a political party allowed to run in elections. So the attempt of this pro-Moldova party to participate in elections was mainly like a play a game in front of their supporters, and to show that and this step, and by not being aware that it will not be registered, they made a step behind and to not participate very active in the campaign. But as secretary of the Civic Coalition, we observed several worrying issues mainly during this pre-electoral campaign, mainly regarding the activity of the authorities responsible for organizing elections, which we consider that pose risks to the conduct of free and fair elections. And first of all I would like to speak about the establishment of polling stations abroad for Moldovan diaspora. Starting last year, the Central Electoral Commission took over from the government the competence to set up polling stations, and legally they should be established based on 3 criteria: the number of previous voters, the second criteria is the preliminary registration, a voluntary action by which the voters could express their will to participate in elections, and to inform the commissions about their location positions on election day. And the quality of the pre-registration process in another subject I would like to approach later. The pre-registration is open all year round and closes shortly before elections, 45 days. And the third criteria is the number of Moldovan citizens residing in foreign countries based on data received officially by the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the foreign authorities. But in fact, what we observed that the data delivered by the ministry is very often based on approximate estimates of the Moldovan diplomatic missions. As recognized officially, the head of the Central Electoral Commissions, when referring to the number of polling stations to be proposed to be open in Russia. He directly publicly recognized that the number of polling stations to be opened in Russia was proposed by the head of the missions in Russia. Another example, which maybe will express the fact that that we are very doubting the accuracy of the information delivered by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is the fact that according to the ministry, we have now 782,000 citizens abroad, and half of them are residing in Russia, and another half in the rest of the world. Surprisingly, in Romania, we have 19,400 citizens, connationals, the same as in Israel. So it's very strange figures. This is why we have recommended this coalition several times, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to make the data more accurate and more transparent. Sorry, I have a call. So the legislation doesn't specify clearly how these three criteria should be applied and if they have an equal weight when deciding the number and location of polling stations. And the Central Electoral Commission has done nothing to clarify this before the second week of September, when it sent a request to the legal committee in the parliament to asking for interpretation of this aspect. First of all, the legal committee is not in charge to do it. This has to be done by the parliament, but it's another problem. So in this regard, we have observed during the entire period, pre-campaign period, a real apathy and disinterest from the Central Electoral Commission for the issue of opening polling stations abroad, and that resulting in a significant delay in the process for determining the number of polling stations. And considering the pandemic, the circumstances imposed by the COVID, so we consider as coalition that these discussions should have been started at least 2 months ago, when the Commission, together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, would have made a preliminary list of polling stations based on the existing criteria, and then using the final data on pre-registration to adjust the list and to add additional polling stations where needed. But what really happened? On July, Czech made an appeal to Moldovan diaspora to propose a number of polling stations and offered 2 weeks to receive the proposal. Surprisingly, the organization from Russia, Diaspora, sent the proposal the next day after this appeal was published. The organization from other countries were less informed, apparently less informed, and started to send their proposals closer to the deadline. And being afraid of a possible public disapproval, the Czech extended the period. And at the beginning of September, the Czech appeared with a list tentative list of number of polling stations, and sent it to the Minister of Foreign Affairs without any public consultation, despite all the appeals of civic coalitions to make all the discussions about the polling stations abroad public and transparent. So the Czech proposed to open 202 polling stations abroad, with 52 more than the planned 150 polling stations. So the document didn't contain any analysis that would justify the number of polling stations, the geographical distributions. So the coalition made an analysis, and we discovered that as compared to polling station proposed by Czech, more polling stations had to be established in Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Switzerland, France, mostly Western countries. On the other side, fewer polling stations as compared to Czech proposals had to be established in Belarus, in Russia, Spain, United States, Portugal, Norway, and so on. So the final decision of polling stations has to be made in few weeks and few days, on 26th of September. We as coalition hope that Czech will make at least 1 day before the decisions will be approved, the draft of these decisions. So, but to conclude, what we observed, that an unjustified boost of polling station in the east, location arbitrarily selected, which are not backed by official data, inaccurate data on Moldovan citizens living abroad, reduced transparency from Czech, And I'll cover, I don't know, I have enough time. I would like to cover two more issues. One is the registration of voters. What we observed that we noticed higher activism of citizens in this year for being pre-registered. Actually, the number of registration this year increased twice compared to 2 years ago. Russia occupies the first place in the top 10 countries with the highest increase in the number of the pre-registrations compared to last year. Actually, the number of their pre-registrations increased by 11 times. In case of other 9 countries, the number grew more modestly, 1.5, 3 times compared to last year. But what the problem with the recent journalistic investigations, but also testimonies of several citizens show that the systems could be very easily eluded by the fraudulent use of personal data. There were registered cases when citizens willing to register discovered that they have been already introduced into the system, surprisingly with the preferred place of voting in Russia. The investigative journalist also found that many signatures from the written requests to be registered in Russia have been falsified. So overall, from 300 registrations made in written to 2,080 were made for Russia. So put in front of this fact, the Czech argued that has no mandate and possibility to check the veracity of this data and that the Minister of Interior and Intelligence Service should handle the situation. And we as a coalition consider that this activism of Moldovan citizens in Russia is very suspicious and seems very much to be well orchestrated. And the last issue I would like to cover, and the other subject about the abusive use of administrative resources and transportation, maybe we'll cover during the Q&A sessions. So the last issue is the abusive interpretation of Czech of the legislations on election campaign and election campaign financing by political parties. To explain shortly, last year the legislation on party and election campaign financing was amended, and the threshold for donations from legal entities was lowered to 12 average monthly salaries. And the same amendments extended the criteria for political parties to benefit from public subsidies by including the results of the presidential elections. So considering this, when the Czech made public decisions or a circular letter interpreting these provisions on September 15, limiting the possibility for political parties to support financially their candidates was very unexpected, surprisingly for everyone. So namely for what Czech made by this interpretation, it allowed the parties to only nominate the candidate, but not to support them throughout the electoral process, equaling them to ordinary legal entities. So, but interesting, so out of the 13 pre-candidates, the incumbent president is an independent candidate. So it will officially not be supported by political parties. And in this situation, using this interpretation of Czech, everyone will be equal to the incumbent president in financing the candidates. We as coalition qualified this an attempt to change the rule of election campaign financing during the game. And we consider that this is unconstitutional and beyond the Czech mandate, and this should be withdrawn, this letter. And to conclude, all these issues and facts prove once again that we need to reform the Central Electoral Commission after the electoral campaign will end, in order to increase its independence and public confidence. It's imperative to reform the way Czech is set up and the way it operates. By establishing permanent membership status for all its members, it will increase its institutional will, management quality. And this should be done quite soon, no later than summer 2021, when the mandate of the current Czech members expires. So we hope that we will have the political will, enough political will to make this change. Thank you. I will cover other issues during the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. Yes, let's please submit your questions through the Q&A button over here on Zoom, we would much appreciate those. Let's turn to Valeriu Pasa, who is a lead policy expert with WatchDog WatchDog organization in Chisinau, Moldova. And Valeriu, go ahead and share your perception of what's going on at the moment, but also if you can provide a little bit of insight in what are the polls saying in terms of the candidates, what is the media coverage in the context of media concentration, also all the abundance of disinformation that has been reported during the pandemic. How is that playing into the campaign?
Thanks, Stella. And first of all, let me thank German Marshall Fund for keeping the attention of the transatlantic community and especially of DC audience on Moldova and on ongoing elections. Let me just start with the continuation of what Elena already touched, especially about the preliminary registration. Actually, this is directly connected to what we are doing as part of a bunch of projects we are implementing this year with the support of Black Sea Trust, of National Endowment for Democracy, of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, of the US Embassy here in Chisinau, all related to understanding and fighting disinformation. We uncovered a preparing stage of influence campaign about preliminary registration back in July. That was a tiny post on the Telegram channel saying that Moldovan diaspora in Europe is not active, don't want to participate in election, don't want to register, but in Russia they are very, very active. And I checked the statistics, official statistic, which is being updated from 5 to 5 minutes on the website of the Central Election Committee, and seeing that the reality is totally different and people from Russia are not active. What that was just an example of a trial to prepare public opinion for the falsification of the results of this registration. That's why actually previously we decided to have a public awareness campaign, a mobilization campaign for Moldovan diaspora from all around the world to participate actively in the preliminary registration. And we done it involving civic activists, public figures, artists, and a lot, like hundreds of volunteers from around the world, Moldovans who live in diaspora. And we managed to increase the total amount, the total number of people who registered from 24,000 during the last 5 years, because all this process started back in 2016. Now we have more than 60,000 in less than 1.5 months. So in this way, we found 6 cases of people who now live in Germany, in Belgium, in Netherlands, who tried to register themselves on this website and were informed that their personal data were used to register themselves in Russia just days before. So from only 3,000 people who, less than 3,000 people who registered themselves online for these elections in Russia, we already found 6 cases of stolen personal data and using of identity. And we notified that publicly, we notified Central Election Committee, we asked for an independent investigation and checking of all these facts, and we are still waiting for response. The same situation was about the registration on papers, like a written request for Central Election Committee to register people for elections in Russia, which were totally falsified because the submission was like it was collected in Russia, but actually person who collected that and signed it, that personally collected all these signatures, never left Moldova in all this period. So these lists were simply collected somewhere in the northern part of Moldova. And when we asked publicly and officially the Central Election Committee to investigate the situation, the National Police, which is politically subordinated to President Dodon, come to Central Election Committee and given for investigation all these documents. This is just a small example. I will come back to the political position of the main candidates. I think we will have not more than 7 candidates with 2 main competitors, which is today's President Igor Dodon and the ex-Prime Minister Maia Sandu. It's absolutely clear that they will go in second turn. Yeah, we have elections in 2 tours. In a very strange manner, President Dodon decided, well, let's say other way, the election staff of President Dodon decided for him that he will run independent, which is actually very funny, but true, because he is totally independent from anyone in Moldova, because he is totally dependent on his chiefs in Kremlin administration, just a candidate of Kremlin here, nothing to well, and he is not just trying to cover that somehow. We have some other, let's say, more or less important candidates, like the mayor of the second biggest city, Renato Osati, who is beating on centrists and more softer pro-Russian or let's say, Soviet nostalgic type voters. But now he's trying to position himself more on the right side, on the pro-European part of electorate. I think he can take 8-10%. It all will depend on his positioning and how well will run his election campaign. Most probably he will be the third. We have another candidate who is the candidate of the ex-mayor of Verhey, Ilan Shor, who is a well-known person. It's MP who just a few months ago left Democratic Party and joined Shor Party in the parliament. Previously, she left Communist Party and joined Democratic Party. So very interesting person. She's running from Shor Party. For them, it's important to concentrate their 6-7 points rating for parliamentary election. And they increased a lot, and it is directly connected to the economic crisis, because this party is not making complicated things. They just buy votes by giving them different help and ad and so on. About the polls, credible polls, because we have an average number of 1.5 poll released in a week. Most of them are simply drawn. We have a bunch of companies, sociological companies who previously worked for Vlad Plahotniuk. Most of them now switched to work for President Dodon. Some of them are financed directly from Moscow. And well, obviously they are doing their internal polls, but are releasing polls which are with better figures for President Dodon. What we know from credible polls, like a barometer of public opinion released in June, or another poll financed by Black Sea Trust and made by us in partnership with the sociological company, is that Maia Sandu and Igor Dodon are very close one to another. From what I've seen in August and start of September, some closed but credible polls, is that Igor Dodon now is up to 2% ahead, but he's losing in second tour in every credible poll. And what's very important is that every of these polls do not take in account the votes abroad, the votes of diaspora, which could count up to from 8 to 13-14% of the total number of votes. So it's being played. Obviously also that the any poll cannot take in account potential falsifications or the use of or misuse of public resources, of administrative resources, pressures on public employees, some, I don't know, gifts, and simply corruption of voters, especially related to the voters who permanently live on the occupied territory of Transnistria. All that is in a bigger or smaller amount connected also to ongoing Kremlin meddling in election process. We have seen already signs of practically every type of this meddling, starting from media coverage, direct political support, economic support given directly to President Dodon, and he can now go in the villages and spread humanitarian aid from Russia. All these talks about this, this global fake narrative about the first and best Russian vaccine, anti-COVID, and whatever you can imagine. What's more important is that the main decision makers in the campaign are consultants from Moscow. And I think we'll manage to release their names till the end of this campaign. We are digging in this direction, so we can say hi to them. The general agenda is extremely infected by a lot of misinformation, fakes, conspiracies connected to the global flows of disinformation and manipulation, or locally produced or adapted to local. For example, we counted for a simple day that was September 8th, an absolutely unimportant day, nothing important happened. We encountered 23 cases of fake news, small conspiracies or manipulation spread in public space only by the by the Telegram channels affiliated to the Socialist Party, or better say to President Dodon, because not so many people from inside Socialist Party have anything to do with this campaign and all this stuff. 23 in just one type of media, and we didn't encounter public speaking, we didn't take a printed media and so on. That was a simple day. So it's, this post-truth term is firmly applicable when president or prime minister come publicly and say that, it is not what you see. For example, prime minister organized, even he personally prohibited a wedding of his son. He prohibited, he organized. And obviously that became publicly, journalists reported about that. After that, he declared, that was not a wedding. That was a simple, a holiday, or, after that, the Ministry of Interior told that was not a wedding. We analyzed that. We will not give them any fines because that was not a wedding. It's incredible how much disinformation and simple lie. It is even not fake news, mostly simple lies. They are building this parallel reality, obviously basing on the very good presence in media and good media coverage, because now president has the most of televisions, not so important part of the market as Plahotniuc had. All remaining Plahotniuc's media is more or less loyal, so they try to be very balanced, but definitely they are not critical to the President Dodon, which we are seeing also as part of a backstage game again between President Dodon, Ilan Shor, and Vlad Plahotniuc and other actors, because they are, let's say, publicly they are acting as political enemies, but we see a lot of signs that they actually are arranging all behind Igor Dodon and will support him in the second tour of election especially. And I think I need to stop here, and we'll continue on Q&A.
Thank you, Valeriu, and thank you for being mindful of the time as well. We will turn to our last speaker, and definitely not the least, Nicu Popescu, who is a former foreign minister of Moldova during Maia Sandu's government and with other government roles in the past. Currently a director for the Wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And Nicu, if we may get a little bit of your perspective of the importance, the relevance of what is going on with this presidential campaign in Moldova, and then how is it going to play into the future of the country? What is the regional importance or more, again, relevance of this elections, especially in the context of what has been happening in Belarus, the upcoming elections in Georgia, the referendum in Russia, local elections in Russia. What are the issues that are being carried over from this presidency into the new presidency, and what is going to have to be the top priority for the new presidency, especially if a new president is elected?
Thank you very much, Stella, Jonathan, Alina, dear friends. It's so great to see so many friends in the list of participants. I'd like to start with the good news. And given that, you know, the word Belarus has been mentioned so many times, I'd like to reconvey to you the good news that Moldova is not Belarus. Moldova has a functioning political system with political parties, with political leaders, with a super strong and vocal and quite consolidated civil society. And most importantly, Moldova has a very strong record of elections. They have been imperfect, but they all changes of power and governments in Moldova have happened through elections, not through revolutions, so this is important. I think Moldova is going into this on a much better, you know, political degree of organization. And sometimes I look at Belarus and, you know, the best thing that could happen to Belarus is again to go through this painful, unstable, but unavoidable type of transition. If you mention Georgia, I'd also have to say that Moldova is not Georgia. And where I think what is striking, Georgia will have elections one day before Moldova. What happened in Georgia is that the Georgian Dream Party was scoring approximately 20% in opinion polls back in January, and now they are up to 35%. So they almost doubled their support, and that's partly because they handled COVID-19 reasonably well. I mean, here I have bad news for Moldova. Moldova did not handle COVID well, and the degree of electoral support is on a very different trend in Moldova. Generally, if I look at the international environment in which these elections are happening, then I must say that Moldova is quite shattered, not just domestically, not just economically, not politically, but on the foreign policy front as well. In theory, what Chisinau says today at the governmental and presidential level sounds reasonable. It says that it wants good relations with everyone, with the US, with the European Union, with Russia, with everyone. The problem is that it doesn't work. So the result, if you look beyond words, is that Moldova is today internationally isolated, and its foreign policy is quite imbalanced and quite dysfunctional. The country has practically frozen relations with Romania, almost frozen relations with Ukraine. Relations with the European are very complicated. The European Union has a dilemma. The current government has zero credibility on reforms in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, in all the European capitals. The European Union, the Moldovan political promises have zero credibility across the European Union. And there isn't a lot of desire throughout the European Union to invest a lot of political capital in helping Moldova. At the same time, Moldova is a neighbor, Moldova is important, and the EU has been looking beyond the current leadership in Moldova. So the EU is still helping Moldova. It's not least through financial means, partly because the European Union does not need nor wants, a series of bankrupted states across its neighborhood. So there are some states where the European Union does not trust the political leadership, but nonetheless helps these countries. That's Serbia and Vučić, that's Moldova under Dodon, that's partly Lebanon these days. But where you see that Moldova significantly underperforms in its relations with Brussels is when you see that Georgia gets twice more assistance than Moldova, and Armenia gets more assistance from Brussels than Moldova does. And Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Union. It did not sign an association treaty, and it's much further away from the European Union. And Moldova always had a much closer relationship with the European Union than Armenia, but today, Moldova gets less support than Armenia from Brussels. And that is a very sad piece of statistics, if you ask me. Yesterday, the European Parliament came with two pieces of negative messaging. There was a report from the European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee, which spoke of Moldova's lack of commitment to reforms. And there was a very tough statement from 3 members of European Parliament condemning potential abuses in this election campaign. And Valeriu and Elena spoke about this in details. But if you look at these statements, then they basically speak and have picked up this negative trend. Relations with the United States are polite, but I don't see a lot of trust between Washington and a small parenthesis, that's a good occasion for me to reinforce that. We have seen some targeted attempts to attack the characters of Derek Hogan, the US ambassador to Chisinau, and of Peter Michalko, the EU ambassador to Chisinau. We've seen that in some US and Canadian media. This looks to me like some lobbyist job. We've seen this before on Ambassador Jovanovic in Kiev, this being done a year and a half ago. Now I see something of a mini campaign targeting personally Derek Hogan and Peter Michalko. This is regrettable. And for the record, I would like to say that Derek and Peter are great forces for good. They work day and night to help Moldova, to keep Moldova on the right track, and to save what can be saved from Moldova's relationship with both Washington and the European capitals. Now, looking at what I said, one, you would expect that maybe relations with Russia are great. And the problem is that they are not. To me, one of the most baffling things is that the government is failing to get benefits from its partnership with Russia. Valeriu spoke about a very high degree of influence of Russia on the Moldovan president. But what I see, if I look at the real facts, and that's not to contest what Valeriu said, I see that Moldova today is paying more for Russian gas than Germany does. I see Moldova not being able to go and get a loan from Russia that would be on beneficial terms for Moldova without attempts to force on Moldova untransparent debts, and we can have a conversation. I also see most of the embargoes that Russia imposed on Moldova and that were valid a year ago, they're still valid. Russia did not really reopen trade access for Moldovan goods compared to what was the case a year ago or 2 years ago. And here I also see, of course, an incapacity to get to a constructive relationship with Russia that is in the interest of the Moldovan agricultural workers, exporters, and consumers of energy and heat and gas in winter. Why is that? For 2 reasons. One is, of course, structural. It's this lack of reforms, and Moldova has lost almost all credibility with those who have supported Moldova throughout years and even decades. No one trusts that Moldova is willing to fight corruption, is willing to reform law enforcement agencies, and that is why Moldova does not get international traction. And there's also a big personalities problem where several of Moldova's key partners, the European Union, the United States, have been personally attacked by the president, by the prime minister. And that is, of course, closing a lot of doors for Moldova internationally. This campaign, 1 more minute, I think the way the campaign is starting now does not look good. We've already have 3-4 processes which might be very detrimental to Moldova's standing. And that will create problems both domestically and internationally if they continue and if they deepen. But at the same time, I do believe that Moldovan society is very well organized, has a strong desire for change and for reforms. Moldovan society showed multiple times in the past that it's not buying easily into lies and misinformation. And what is also reassuring me is that Moldova remains super tied to Europe and the West. And if you want me to bring it back to Belarus, you'd see that, 49% of Belarus trade is with Russia and 64% of Moldovan trade is with the European Union. I mean, no leadership in Chisinau can avoid the need for being very careful what it's doing, both in domestic and foreign policy, because Moldova cannot afford to be isolated from the EU and from Washington. And that is something which will matter and already matters in the weeks to come. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nicu, for your contribution to this conversation. And I would like to remind everyone that the Q&A is open, and I will be facilitating some of the questions that we're getting. We also received some questions ahead of time, so I will try to squeeze those in. We have a little bit of time remaining, so feel free to ask your questions. I will start with an earlier received questions today in the conversation, and it pertains to the Gagavuz region. And if any one of you could comment a little bit of on what is going on, is there any like more specific standing that the Gagavuz community is taking on this election? Are they backing up a certain candidate? Are they trying to figure out a way for them to kind of have a role or a say in this election? And maybe Valeriu, maybe Elena, you could chip in on this discussion, and then we'll turn to further questions.
Okay, I think I will try. First of all, we need to understand that the informationally, the Gagavuz community is a little bit isolated from the rest of the country, especially due to their media consumption that is practically 100% Russian language. So obviously, even the impact of Russian media and all these Russian narratives work better there. And to understand the impact in 2016, in second tour, Igor Dodon got 99% of votes in Gagauzia. I'm pretty sure that the result will not be such big this year, but definitely not very different. Gagauzia is now the main beneficiary region for European assistance for last 4 or 5 years. No any region of Moldova received more funds and projects. They're also supported by Turkey, obviously, also by US programs, but that will not change a lot. And I'm pretty sure that the Bashkan, the head of Gagauzia, Irina Vlach, will be connected to the campaign. She will openly support and bring all her resources to support President Dodon. Why? Not because she loves or likes him, definitely not. But she's very dependent from the political support from Russia. So this is part of the same, influence deployed here by Russian Federation.
Thank you. And yeah, what we're seeing a little bit of a trend from what you guys are commenting and what Elena has also been presenting earlier. There is a perception that there is a very high chance probability for Russia playing a much more of a role in affecting the fairness and the freedom of our upcoming elections. In this sense, I want to ask a little bit about maybe a question to Elena and then to Nicu. On Elena, how is the observation of the campaign going to happen? I know there is a potential OSCE mission coming to Moldova, and then how is the coalition going to cooperate with the OSCE mission in Moldova, but also what is going on in terms of the actual observation of elections in the country and also maybe abroad, especially in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and how is that being changed? And then to Nicu, a continuation, I guess, to this question: if it is determined that the election is fraudulent, what would you see, or how would you want to see the US, the EU, and other countries that are partners of Moldova's development in terms of their reaction? What would you like to see?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to inform you that the OCC mission has already deployed its mission. Today they had a meeting with the Central Electoral Committee and discussed and presented their mission. So coalition has a very good relation with all international observers that are deploying here, and we are in continuous contact with them, sharing the information and their findings about the domestic observation. There was some risk included in the previous draft law amending the legislations, which passed on the first reading. So there's some risk for the domestic observers, but now this draft was not finally adopted. So now the domestic observers operate as previously, so without any impediments. But the problem is how we'll manage to observe the elections outside, so in the out-abroad polling stations. PromoLex, which is doing the observation mission, they'll have this year 60 observers outside. Out of them, only maybe 20 in the east. The problem is that it's very difficult because due to the COVID restriction, there are problems with the transportation to move these observers or to transport these observers to the polling stations abroad. But to find some credible observers in Russian is as well quite difficult issue, because the person, you have to find a person which is more or less apolitical, or at least doesn't very public express its opinion. To find such a person inside our connationals, which have a long lives in Russia, is quite difficult because they are financially dependent, and actually they'll not risk all their lives for 1 or 2 days of elections. So these are the issues, but the observation in Russia will be very important because there is a high risk that this observation will be stolen. We know how the elections in Russia are going, how the ballots are thrown in the booths. So without observers in any section in Russia, there is a high risk that the ballots sent to the Russian will go to the Russian candidate.
Thank you. And Nicu, what do you think if it is determined that it's fraudulent election, what should the West do?
Listen, I think, that's a legitimate question, but before we talk about the after, there is a lot we can do now so that we don't arrive to the situation where the international community and primarily the Moldovan citizens consider the election stolen. So I think there's enough time now to handle this in a way that does not lead to a further worsening of the campaign and of the electoral process itself. And I will just draw your attention to a couple of elements if you want. Of course, who and how will observe how the voting is being conducted abroad. Who will observe the polling stations in Russia or in France or in Sweden or Turkey? These are important questions. We need a solution that is transparent and quick and feasible, because also we are not in a position to travel easily between countries. Second, if you want a kind of problematic point, is the Transnistrian vote. What does happen in the Moldovan polling stations facing the region of Transnistria? Will there be thousands of people being bused to vote? In 2009, there were 37,000 voters bused in from Transnistria, which at the time represented more than 2%, almost 2.5% of the overall voting numbers. So in a closely contested election, 2-3% might be decisive. So here my message is, of course, the residents of Transnistria who have Moldovan citizenship and passports have the right to vote. But the right to vote is not the same as the right to sell your vote for $20. And that is why we will need strong monitoring for these polling stations. It's fine for people to come and vote, not by buses and not selling their vote. It's not legal to sell your vote. So we need a lot of international attention to that other segment where there are risks. And we just need to be careful. I think a couple of weeks ago, there was almost this impression that, there is the case of Navalny, there is Belarus, there is not a lot of international attention paid to Moldova. This is changing. The European Parliament yesterday came with 2 statements, the event today. It is obvious that even if there are other crises in the region, even if Montenegro goes through a difficult transition, even if Belarus is in protests, there is attention and there is energy not to forget about Moldova. This is being felt, this is visible, and continue doing this. This is my message to those of you who listen to us in European capitals, in capitals across the world, in North America. Pay attention, be strict, the standards are known. Moldova fulfilled the standards before, it can do so again.
Thank you, Nicu. Indeed, very good points. And Valeriu, I'm sure you have some ideas on also what can be done by national and international observation efforts, both in Moldova and abroad, to try and deter some of this potential fraud.
Well, first of all, I think we need to be, we need to follow where the signs of potential frauds are. The request of Central Election Committee as a result of request of Moldovan embassy in Russia, which is headed by a member of Socialist Party and a very close person affiliated to President Igor Dodon. They asked 38 polling stations to be opened in Russia, from which 18 sections at 18 stations only in Moscow and suburbs of Moscow. Taking into account that in all Russian Federation at the last parliamentary election voted less people than, or less Moldovan diaspora members than in London or in Paris or in a lot of northern Italy cities. It's absolutely ungrounded. You have no ground to ask for so many polling stations. Based on this logic, only in London, they should propose 40 polling stations, but they propose 4 polling stations. They should propose 45 polling stations in Paris and suburbs, but they proposed 4 polling stations. So there is no any other logic than the attempt to create grounds for massive falsification of results. And if we are speaking about figures, 38 polling stations mean 190,000 ballots, which will mean something like 12% of total potential voters. Yeah. So more than enough to change the balance of the result. That's why my public appeal for international community is to help us with observation, because we cannot send observers from here because we are during COVID. Moldova is in the worst situation in the region, and we cannot send people to Moscow. They are prohibited now because of COVID. And to take observers from Moldovan diaspora who live in Moscow, for example, is a little bit dangerous because these people are very exposed to the punishment of Russian police and so on. And Russia is whatever you want, but not a rule of law country. That's why I think as a part of international observers missions, maybe that could be established by the European Parliament, why not? A lot of people who work in the embassies of United States, of EU member states, in Moscow or in consulates, could be the very good observers in every of these polling stations which will be opened in Russia. I think that's realistic. About OSCE, well, I follow their reports, but I'm definitely not a fan of their language and methods of observation. It's too much soft. And we see in their reports after, for example, very problematic but I think falsified elections in February 2019 organized by Plahotniuk with tens of thousands of bribed voters, with extremely uncompetitive election campaign, with large-scale punishment of public workers and local authorities from those time government and law enforcement agencies. And the report of OSCE was, very soft for these facts. So, well, this is what I think on this issue.
Thank you, Valeriu. Very, very useful comments. In terms of the vote abroad, you did mention that you may see potential voter suppression, at least for the observation portion, right, in Russia, which is a very interesting thing that you're mentioning now. From at least my personal observation of having observed elections and worked on elections for the last 15 years, it's likely the first time that I hear that intensity for the voters abroad specifically. So thank you for pointing that out. One other question that we have received from our audience is, well, a few questions. If any one of you, maybe Valeriu, maybe I think you would be more well positioned to comment on Andrei Năstase's candidacy for the presidential elections, given his previous experiences, and not just his personal, but more on the party side and their role in the previous government and things like that.
Well, sure, I can. What we have now with practically the electoral bloc ACUM was broken. My understanding is that mainly guilty for that is personal Andrei Năstase. I will not totally defend Maia Sandu. I think that she could done more to maintain that, but she probably need to or needed to put her energy in other part. What we have now is that the popularity of the party of Andrei Năstase decreased a lot, mainly because of his extremely poor performance as the Minister of Interior, both as a manager and secondly as a corruption fighter, because he done nothing about fighting corruption schemes in the ministry and in police. After that, he decided absolutely wrong decision, and I even publicly spoke about that last year, to run again as for mayor of Chisinau. He was zero prepared to run. Obviously, he lost of much better prepared candidate of socialists who really worked hard in the campaign and years before to understand the city problems, solutions, and so on. And obviously, he won elections. After that, the popularity of Dignity and Truth Party decreased a lot. Mr. Năstase promised in election campaign for Chisinau City Council that if he will lose elections, he will leave Moldova and leave the politics. Unfortunately for the party, he didn't respect even this simple promise. That's why his bad rating affected party's rating. What he's doing now, he decided to use these presidential elections as an opportunity to regain some rating. Obviously, most of his voters gone to Maia Sandu and her party. That's why his like 90% of his energy are being spent on public attacks against Maia Sandu. He hopes probably that if Maia Sandu will lose elections, he will have some opportunity to regain some rating, which is totally untrue. At the end of the day, what we see, I don't know the real, evaluations or political strategies that he has and his party, but he's helping President Dodon, and he's helping a lot. I don't know, or I don't want to believe that this is part of a backstage agreement. But more and more voices and political observers here in Chisinau start to think that this is like too much coincidences in narratives, in speeches, and in objectives. This is what I can say about it.
Thank you. And one more question that relates to the voters' engagement in the vote. We've received, to what extent do you think, and maybe Elena and Valeriu can comment on this, to what extent do you think that both COVID, but also voters' apathy in general may actually impact the results of the elections?
We see throughout Europe that there is a lowering electoral turnout during the elections due to the COVID. So there is a high chance that the COVID will influence the electoral turnout in Moldova as well. But it will depend how as well how the electoral contestants will mobilize the electorate. We'll see.
Valeriu, what do you think, especially in terms of voter apathy?
From what we see in the polls starting from April, I think, yeah, there are some clear signs of not very active turnouts. But this is not connected on COVID only, like people don't go to vote just because they are afraid to not be infected. This is more like a general disappointment of the quality of politics.
Exactly.
Well,
yeah.
COVID factor is extremely important as a changer in ratings. The rating of President Dodon and his party decreased a lot. And the only important factor was a disastrous way they managed the pandemic. As public communication, as everything you can imagine. That should be a different conference only on this issue. But in Moldova, there is only one really important factor which decide the result of any national elections: the turnout. How many voters will go and vote? And we have classically the so-called left, but actually pro-Russian part, which is very mobilized every time and very well organized. And we have a really bigger part of pro-European voters, but who are not so, well organized and clearly determined to go and vote. So this is the big changer of potential outcome. That will depend on diaspora, because, for example, we had 138,000 people who voted in second tour in 2016. The real potential, because we have more than 1 million voters abroad, real potential is 250,000 votes. If we will have 200,000 votes in diaspora, President Dodon have no chances to win, even with some, small or even larger scale frauds. If the presence in diaspora will be less than 50,000, I think that Maia Sandu has no chance to win in the second tour. But also mobilization, especially in urban areas. This is the big changer of the game. So
right.
who will mobilize better will win elections. And this is mainly a target for the right wing or for a pro-European wing candidate, Maia Sandu. And that's why this conflict between Andrei Năstase or other right-wing candidates and Maia Sandu are so toxic for the final outcome, for the final result, because these conflicts and these reciprocal attacks between them demotivate people to participate in the election. And this is basically one of the most strategies of President Dodon, because his media and commentators and trolls online and so on are fueling very, very well this conflict between pro-European candidates.
So just a quick follow-up, Valeriu, on this last comment that you made, in terms of the tactics of the trolling, the disinformation, the communication, mobilizing of the vote, What do you see most recently being used, especially on social media? And you did make an earlier reference to Telegram, but there is Facebook, there is Odnoklassniki, there is Instagram that's really picking up in Moldova right now, TikTok, and all of those social media. What do you see in terms of tactics being used by both people associated with candidates, but also not so clearly associated with one or other candidates?
Well, if we'll speak about disinformation and fakes on Facebook, classic fakes is still more about pandemic and related to COVID, to conspiracies or fake cures and so on. Politically, the Facebook is practically lost for President Dodon. We are making polls, especially online polls on a very large number of respondents on Facebook, and it is very hard to find President Dodon supporters on Facebook. About Odnoklassniki in Moldova is managed by a company which indirectly is controlled personally by President Dodon. So it's a proxy person who owns officially a lot of companies which normally belongs to President Dodon. And so they are managing Odnoklassniki directly. So you cannot put any advertisement on social or political issues on Odnoklassniki. They simply refuse. Only if it is something very positive for Russian narratives or for President Dodon, you will be allowed to do that. So this is what we have on Odnoklassniki. Yeah, it's like a hand management of all the process. What we see now, last 2 weeks, very quick increasing number of fake accounts posting on very political issues, very positive for President Dodon and his party. So this is a new growing troll factory. We are encountering some issues. We have some very interesting observation, but we are speaking on record. So I will keep it as a surprise, just as we done to the fugitive Plakhatnyuk just before parliamentary election when we, well, I will not continue with that.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the surprises. I'm going to go with a last question for Nicu, if I may, Nicu. And it basically refers to, you've been a member of the government before, and I'm sure you're still watching what's going on in the country, and you've seen the instability of both the parliament and the government over the past 9 months or so. What do you think is going to come after the presidential elections, both in a scenario where President Dodon stays in power or he loses and has to transfer power to a new president, to a different person? What do you expect the changes would be? And then what are the issues that will still remain on the top of the presidency agenda? And there is another follow-up question that if you want to touch on it, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but why is Plakhatnyuk and Shor not being extradited to Moldova yet?
So, Stella, if you allow me to take the first question. Listen, I believe in structural constraints on countries. If you look back at Armenia 2 years ago, 2.5 years, you know, no matter what happened in domestic politics, Armenia had to remain in the type of relationship that it had with Russia before 2018. It had to retain its security, strategic, military, and economic relationship with Russia. If you look at Belarus today, it's also a lot of people are saying that even if the opposition manages to come to power, they will stick to a very close partnership with Russia. Why is that? It's partly because leaders might like or might dislike some things, but countries are tied not just through their leaders to some partners, but through trade, through dependencies, through pipelines, through public opinion in multiple ways. And here I think Moldova is on the opposite end of dependencies if I compare it to Armenia and Moldova. Moldova is just so tied to Europe. And even we've seen it with President Dodon's change of opinions over the last few years. A few years ago, he was openly anti-European. He was against the association agreement, but you cannot maintain the type of public positioning in Moldova. That's why I think that these relations, they can throw domestic politics into a major crisis if they are abuses. They will force Moldova potentially, if there are abuses, into a very difficult international context. But there's no escape from Moldova, for whoever is in power, from being completely dependent on the European Union. And they will have to listen to Brussels, to Berlin, to Paris. That is a bit what makes me more optimistic about Moldova's capacity to overcome this risky context. And here we're talking about, potential abuses. No government of Moldova can survive in power by abusing indecently the electoral process, neither domestically nor on the foreign policy front.
Yeah, indeed, Nico. And just a quick follow-up as we're considerate of the time. Do you think here there is a role for both the EU and US actually like addressing a message to Kremlin and saying, we're watching what's going on in Moldova, and we're watching on what you guys are doing, and we will have a position. Is that relevant at any point right now?
A lot of what happens here, and I would like to draw your attention to this series of research, partly based on leaks about how Russia supports Georgian political parties on this dossier center.
Right.
This is the exact same methodology that is probably applied in Moldova. That is the exact same people who are probably in charge of Moldova. Read about Georgia, replace Moldova, put the name Moldova instead of Georgia, and you'll get a rough picture of how this works in Moldova. Now it's very hard for, kind of EU country leader to raise this in these terms, because a lot of this assistance is done in an untransparent manner. But despite this, look at the opinion polls, and you would see that despite all of that assistance, despite a lot of media support, financial help, not much is given to the country as a whole. And I'm back to gas prices, embargoes that are still in, and that significantly limits Russia's capacity to actually speak to the Moldovan voters. Some of this money and funds are channeled into political parties, but the population at large is not really benefiting from a good relationship between the leadership of the country and Moscow.
Thank you very much for your contributions. And before I turn it back to Jonathan and Alina for some closing notes, I want to take the opportunity to thank the speakers, but also the audience for your continuous interest in what is going on in the country and your support to democratic reform and to all the good things.
Thank you, Stella. I also want to just join in thanking our speakers today. Alina, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add before we check out, but I wanted to, want to thank you, but also on a couple of points that I heard today. One is, I think it's very much welcome, from what I hear, increased engagement of and attention of the US, the EU, international partners of Moldova in responding to sort of the pre-election period. And sort of Valeriu, I thought, had some a good suggestion on sort of how to engage with potential fraudulent voting in spaces like Russia, but also obviously applying these to international polling stations for diaspora writ large is critical, because it sense to me that's one of the key areas. Also Transnistria as well, what Nicu and Valeriu and Elena all pointed out too about the potential for fraudulent voting, or at least not fraudulent voting, but people's votes being, I guess that is votes being bought is fraudulent as well. So thank you for pointing that out. Also with respect to Russia and Nico and others, I think people I think there's an understanding of the increasing levels of interference, and it would seem to make a lot of sense given the response of the EU, the US, and others to what's taking place in Georgia, that a similar type of response needs to be equal in spaces like Moldova and elsewhere. And so I think that's important. So on that note, Alina, I don't know if you want to just jump in with any final thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank the speakers and the participants for this very interesting discussion, and just say one final comment before the webinar started. I did a little scroll looking for news from Moldova, both in English and in Romanian. And there are very, very few news coming out of Moldova. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure there is so much attention really put on Moldova. There are a lot of bad things that are happening, not only in the region, but worldwide. So EU and the US and everybody else is really focusing on too many things right now, especially on too many bad things. So maybe if something good was to happen in Moldova, that would really catch the attention of everybody. So I hope this will happen. Thank you.
Definitely, thank you. And just before we leave, we have about 4 minutes left. I don't if our speakers have any last word, please raise your hand. I see Valeriu raising his hand too. So Valeriu, maybe send it to you, Nico and Elena. If you guys, Lena, if you have something that you want to add, please feel free to just let me know that you want to speak. Valeriu.
Yeah. By the way, related to the information, especially in English. We are producing a weekly newsletter in English about the main political and election-related issues. So we encourage all the people to become subscribers. I hope Gemma will help us to spread this invitation. We consider this is really important to keep international stakeholders updated on what's going on here, to be better informed. And as a final, what we really need to keep in mind is that this presidential election is just a new step of a prolonged political instability in Moldova, because we still don't have a political majority in the parliament. And this instability will continue and will be combined with a very harsh economic crisis that we are facing at the end of the year. And with the government, which didn't manage to sign the agreement with the IMF, and the economical turbulence at the end of this year and beginning of next year looks to be very, very complicated. And in the same time, Moldova is on the last place in Europe on the quality of management of COVID pandemic. Today, we've broken the historic record of daily cases. This is 786 cases encountered today. Yeah, we have higher percentage of positive tests all around, I think, the world, but definitely in Europe. And all that is still in place, and all these three crises combined are very dangerous in mid-term and short-term. So I think also the international community need to keep that in mind, and also after presidential election to pay more attention on a potential cooperation between all political parties. Otherwise, we can face a Lebanon-type crisis here, where with a very segmented and stupid political class, with economical disaster, and with pandemic, which is even on higher rates.
Valeriu, thank you for pointing that out. We look forward to sharing sort of newsletters and updates beforehand, but I think you raised the point of the vector of these major issues kind of coming together at the same time and having a really catastrophic impact for Moldovans, but also for partners and the region as well. Because what we know about the pandemic and sort of the economics is that we are all interconnected in addressing this issue together over a period, that you can't have, you have these massive pockets of infected and those impacted by the coronavirus. It spreads and it impacts others directly connected. Nico, any last thoughts before we end? Okay. Elena?
What's something that as representing the coalition, so I could assure you that the coalition will continue to keep an eye on what is happening during these elections and to inform the international missions and the donors and development partners in Moldova about any issues or any other concerns we'll identify. And maybe in 2 weeks, we are going to organize a meeting with development partners and donors in Moldova and to present our findings and our results of the monitoring activities we carried out.
Great. Well, hopefully, and I'm sure there will be a significant reaction to what's needed, and hopefully, I'm certain people are planning and thinking about this. Obviously, COVID-19 makes it more difficult particularly on the international observation side, to have that perspective. Alina mentioned what Black Sea Trust is planning to do beforehand, and which I think will be one part of an effort to observe and understand, and then also react to what's taking place in Moldova. Stella, I just wanted to also just to close to thank you for moderating. I don't know if you have any final words that you want to impart before we leave.
I just wanted to say that we will try and organize another event on Moldova closer to the election day, and hopefully we'll be able to update you on what's been going on in the campaign, last moment thoughts and messages, and we're looking forward to seeing you there again. And thanks again for your continued interest.
Thank you for that final word. And as Stella said too, we're committed to focusing on Moldova and the elections, and through both Washington and our other offices, but also obviously the work of the Black Sea Trust and Alina and her team. And so on that note, thank you to everybody who's joined today. We'll be sharing the video, this video of the event online. So if you want to go back, please check it out. And then again, on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, thank you to our speakers mostly, and we applaud you. I wish we were all together or in a space together to have these conversations, but these are the days that we're in, but we're looking forward to following up in the coming days. So on that note, thank you everybody, and have a good rest of your days.